Right. Hi, everybody. English teacher Paul here again. So this is our third lesson about English language discourses. What we're going to do today is that we're going to have a go at an English language paper 2, section B, question 3 on the A level, looking at language discourses. So let's kick off by looking at slide 44. And first of all, let me go whole screen. Excuse me while the screen goes blank for a moment. And here we go. Okay, so obviously we're on an A-level course, and therefore the bottom line is that we need to know our terms. We need to know our concepts and our terms. So in our booklet, we've got a load of concepts and terms on page 29 and 31, and you would be well advised to go back to those pages and to test yourself. So how many of those A-level English language A01 terms can you remember? What examples could you give of each? And so what I've done on this screen is I've just picked out 10 randomly from those terms, which we'll talk through. Let's see if you can remember what these terms mean. Number 1, primary auxiliary verbs. Remember those? Yeah, so primary auxiliary verbs, there are 3 in English, aren't there? So there's to be, to have, and to do. To be, to have, and to do. And auxiliary means supporting or helping. So we need those verbs to be and to have and to do for, in standard English, to construct various constructions. For example, if we're wanting to do the progressive aspect of a verb in English, like I am talking, then if we're going to do standard English, we have to put that little word am in there instead of just saying I talking. So am there is a form of the verb to be. That's the primary auxiliary verb. So we use the verb to be constructing things like the passive voice and to be using progressive aspect verbs. We use have to construct things like the perfect tense, as in I have lived in Darlington forever. And we use do for doing things like negating sentences, like I don't like chips. I mean, who would say that? And asking questions like, do you like chips? So primary auxiliary verbs to be and to have and to do. That's term number 1. Term number 2, euphemism. Remember that one? Okay, so euphemistic language is veiled, cloaked language which hides the horrible truth. So I'll just go off and spend a penny, or I'll just go off and powder my nose, are examples of euphemisms, and various sectors of public life use euphemisms in all kinds of interesting ways. Like the military might talk about collateral damage or friendly fire, for example, or in the world of business, people might be let go instead of being fired. So euphemistic language is a really interesting area to look at under a kind of occupational jargon. Synthetic personalization. Remember that one? So synthetic personalization, I think, is a noun phrase coined by the linguist Norman Fairclough. And synthetic means artificial, and personalization. So this means the kind of informal, personalized kind of language that big institutions use in order to create the illusion that they've somehow got a relationship with you. So your phone pings and you get a text message from Virgin Media saying, hi, Paul. And you think, who's this? And then you realize that it's actually just an organization that's trying to sell you stuff. So synthetic personalization is using that kind of language in informal ways in order to try and influence you. Okay, term number 4. Cohesive devices. And now I will talk to you about cohesive devices. So the bit I just said there, and now I will talk to you about, that is a cohesive device, because a cohesive device is a chunk of language that basically connects up one bit of language to the next bit. So it can be connecting words together, or phrases, or clauses, or sentences, or paragraphs. So you will have learnt about this at GCSE when you learnt words like moreover and furthermore, or where you were put together an argument where you went, firstly. So cohesive arguments are are bits of language that glue together aspects of language. Next one, implicature. Implicature is just a posh way of saying implying things. So if I said to you, well, your homework was very interesting. So the very interesting comment there, with the slightly sarcastic prosodic features going on there, might be implying that there was something wrong with it, for example. So you might infer from it that there is trouble afoot. So implicature is all about implying things beyond the literal kind of surface meaning of the words. Ellipsis. Ellipsis is simply the missing out of words. So when you use elliptical constructions in sentences, then you render them non-standard. Just done that now, instead of I have just done that now. Ellipsis. Next one, hegemony. So hegemony is the kind of power, the linguistic power that groups use to make things feel like they're kind of normal ways of thinking or behavior. So, for example, the way that people toss around the word chav, for example, to make it feel normal that you can kind of label whole groups of people with that one noun phrase. That's to do with hegemony. So it's a way of influencing people using words in order to make them feel like that way of thinking is kind of normal. Hegemony, really interesting term. Partly concealed there, but that's a temporal adverbial. So an adverbial is a chunk of words that are used to describe something about a verb, and temporal means it's to do with time. So all it means is an expression like next Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock. That's a temporal adverbial. It's a chunk of words that are telling you about a time scale. Right, what's next? Deixis. Deixis is context-dependent speech, or any language. E.g., she put it there yesterday. She, it, there, yesterday. All of those things there, you would have to be there in that particular context to understand exactly what was being meant. So they're all deictical references, and the noun is deixis. Right, one left, I think. Coordinating connective. Oh, well, that's easy enough. So those are words like and so and but. So those connecting words that connect things together. So if you've got an article where you've got sentences that begin with and, then that's going to lower the level of formality because it's trying to achieve kind of speech-like conversational features, maybe an attempt to create some kind of synthetic personalization with you, the reader. Okay, did you enjoy that? I did. So you've got yourself a whole load of AO1 terms on pages 29 to 31 of the booklet. Get cracking on them. Go through them first of all without your notes. And then if there are any gaps in your knowledge, plug them. Okay, so what we're going to do for the rest of this is to be focusing on one bit of discourses. And we're looking at the paper 2, question 3, which is phrased like this. Analyse how language is used in text A and text B to present views about, and then whatever the thing that's being talked about. Okay, you're going to spend an hour on this question in the exam, and it's going to be marked for 3 things. So AO1 is your key terms, linguistic methods, and written expression. So all that stuff that we've just done about your key terms, that's all going to be assessed there in that assessment objective. Linguistic methods means applying the kind of language analytical tools that you've been learning on the course. So, for example, if you're constructing a paragraph that's entirely about grammatical features in the articles, understanding what is meant by grammatical features. That's a linguistic method. And then good old written expression, which is not just SPUG, i.e. spelling, punctuation and grammar, but is also about cohesion as well, i.e. how effectively are you using things like topic sentences at the beginnings of paragraphs in order for your poor reader to try and navigate your essay. So AO1 gets a mark out of 10. Now your AO3 gets a higher mark, that's a mark out of 15, And that's all about meanings and representations, because the articles that you've got here, the most important things aren't really the style features. The most important things really are the ideas, aren't they? So AO3 is trying to assess how good are you at picking up the various meanings, which might be explicit or they might be implicit, going on in the texts. And also under AO3, you are looking at the influence of context on the language as well. So when we say context, we mean our good old friends: audience, purpose, genre, mode, and the wider kind of social context of the pieces. Okay, so they're all going to impact on the meaning in big ways. And the third and final AO is AO4, which is about comparison. Okay, so you've been doing comparison in lots of other bits of the course, not least your coursework, where you had to be comparing your style model with your article or your short story. So by this stage in the course, you should be quite used to having to compare things. Okay, so let's have a think about what sorts of texts that you're going to be given on this question 3. First thing to say is that clearly, because you're being asked to compare them, they're going to be on a similar topic. And the topic, we don't know what the topic is, but it's going to be anything that's to do with broadly the subject of language change or to do with language diversity. So, for example, you might get 2 articles which are about jargon, the uses and abuses of occupational jargon. That would be one area. Or, and they've given this one in the past, you could have one which is about regional accents, either way that people respond to and the possible discriminations and prejudices which are attached to regional accents. Okay, so it's going to be a subject that's something to do with language change or language diversity. The 2 texts that you've got may be of quite unequal lengths, as you'll see in a minute. So don't necessarily assume, even though you're comparing them and you have to give equal weight to the 2 of them, that actually the 2 texts are going to be equally long. They'll probably be written for different kinds of implied audiences. So one of the texts might be written for, let's say, a broadsheet readership. There may be, for example, a bit more depth and sophistication to the ideas, or it may be written for a certain kind of liberal audience, or maybe a more kind of conservative with a small c traditional kind of audience. And the second text might be, for example, from a tabloid newspaper, like a blue top tabloid newspaper like the Daily Mail or the Daily Express. So the likelihood is that the 2 pieces are going to be for slightly different audiences and therefore will be written in different ways. So the 2 pieces, both of them may be opinion articles, where it's just one journalist who's giving a viewpoint, but not necessarily so, because they could give you things like news reports, and in those news reports it will have certain opinions that are being put forward by so-called experts. So be on your guard for that. The news reports ones are tricky because it may seem like, well, this is just neutral information that's being given to me. But of course, in newspapers and journalism, there's really no such thing as neutral information. There are always purposes behind the information that you're being fed. So always look to see, what publication this is and what you think the purposes are behind the pieces. Don't assume that there's going to be just one viewpoint that's being put forward about language. Don't assume, for example, that because an article begins with quite a strongly prescriptive viewpoint, that the whole shebang is going to be completely prescriptive, because there may well be quite big shifts or subtle shifts in viewpoints. So be on your guard for that. Be warned as well that, in the heat and sweat of the exam situation, you might end up with quite challenging texts. In the past, they love taking, for example, articles from the Guardian newspaper, a left-leaning broadsheet newspaper, and don't expect to be able to just pick it up very easily. There'll be all sorts of pragmatic things going on underneath it. So basically, the more reading that you can do on the course, as we keep saying, and particularly very good journalism, then the better you will be at this kind of thing. And then finally, make a note of the point that the articles will probably be written by journalists, and therefore not kind of trained academics or linguists. Okay, so a lot of the information that you've got there may not be completely data-based. They may not have that kind of cautious approach that most academics go in for, and therefore they may be quite hyperbolic, because what the journalists are trying to do is to court a particular audience. Okay, so let's now go to a couple of examples of discourse texts. Here's the first one. This is taken from the good old Huffington Post. Text A, this is written by somebody called William Hanson, who prides himself on being an etiquette expert and social commentator. Good heavens. And so this one is called Accents Aren't Always Acceptable, Pet. And that's the beginning of that text. So there you are. You've got an online opinion article that's written by somebody who calls himself an etiquette expert and social commentator. So there's one example. That's not the complete text, of course. That's just the beginning of it. And sort of matched with that is this thing called HuffPost super user. It's not just a user, it's a super user. This is Queen of Fern, after all. And this appears to be a kind of comment in response to this article that's been written on Huffington Post. So this is interesting because presumably it's a similar kind of audience. If this is a comment that's written in response to Huffington Post, they're from the same site, but they'll be very different sorts of writers. And that actually is in the entire piece. So you can see that that's a very, very short piece. And yet you're going to have to compare that in an hour with a quite lengthy article. Okay, so that gives you an idea of an example text. Now, these full texts are on page 32 to 34. So I would advise you to be looking at those next. And what we'll do is we'll talk through these. So I'm imagining that I'm you in the exam. I've turned the paper over. I know what I have to do. I know I have to analyse and compare the articles. And so I'm going to try and deconstruct some of the language. So this is text A, and this is a headline that says, accents aren't always acceptable, pet. Well, that's fairly generic in terms of a headline because it's quite compressed language and it's quite dramatic language that's being used as well. We have pet being used, so this signals to us that this may be a piece that's about regional dialect in some way. It's talking about accents. What it actually means is regional accents. So the fact that it doesn't say regional accents on the beginning maybe implies that this isn't written by an academic. It's using the copular verb there. The copular verb is the main verb to be when it's used as a main verb, i.e. saying that A is B. So in this case, accent aren't, that's the copular verb. So copular verbs are used in quite a strident, dogmatic way. They make the writer sound like they're absolutely sure and certain about something, and therefore they can be trusted because they're an authority on this subject. And another generic feature in terms of headlines here is the use of the assonance, i.e. the repetition of the vowel at the beginning of the words there. And that makes it actually quite tricky to read out aloud, which may connect in with the argument which this writer is making about intelligibility of local dialects and accents. So an interesting headline. Here's the beginning. Selfridges, the upmarket department store chain, have banned their employees in their 2 Manchester branches from using expressions such as hiya, see ya, and cheers when addressing customers over fears they are too colloquial and sounding like Coronation Street extras. Staff at the shops have understandably reacted against this new policy. One assistant said to a local newspaper, "It's all a bit bizarre considering we are a Manchester store. Many of our shoppers are from the Manchester area." So it's an interesting start because although this is an opinion article, it's really starting off giving us a little bit of news. And that's important because it kind of supplies the context of what the opinion is going to be about. So it's telling us who was involved, what's happened, where, when, so that then we've got like a firm foundation for what this opinion is going to outline. Bits in blue are some of the bits that kind of stand out to me as I'm reading this for the first time. I'm seeing this word banned here. So it's showing here that the shop has had quite a strong reaction to people's use of language, which is interesting in itself. And it's using the word fears here. So it's drawing upon the discourse of anxiety to show that other people's, it's always other people's language choices are causing concern and anxiety here amongst the managers at this particular shop. And the criticism is that the voices sound too colloquial and sounding like Coronation Street extras. So here, this is commenting about non-standard forms, really, and it's focusing on people's accent and dialectical features and making a judgment about it. So it sounds like the bosses at Selfridges are being quite prescriptive in the way that they're laying down the rules about language. It puts about the response of the staff at the shop, because they have reacted against this new policy. So we've got here what we often get in pieces of journalism. We've got the conflict of discourse. We've got the discourse of conflict. Get it the right way around. You've got the discourse of conflict, where you've got, the managers of the store who are trying to ban certain language being used. And then you've got the employees on the shop floor who are reacting against it. So language is seen here as a kind of battleground between two kind of binary oppositions. And the adverb that's being used here, understandably, shows that the writer at this stage is empathic, that they are understanding and are sympathetic towards the viewpoints of the people on the shop floor. So at this point, you might be thinking, well, this is a writer who is going to be writing an opinion in support of local accents and dialects. And it goes on to quote from one of the people working there. It shows journalistic endeavour, that the journalist has gone to the bother of actually asking people about their views. And it states the viewpoint that it's strange that people should be criticised for using local language when most of the shoppers who are in that shop, they are from Manchester. So it kind of sets up the argument in quite an interesting way. We're now onto the second paragraph. I can see their points, but I am probably on the side of their bosses, who clearly want to portray a more cosmopolitan image. Selfridges is a nationwide brand, and whilst the majority of the customers in the Manchester branches will be local, there will be a significant percentage not from Greater Manchester, having travelled there from further afield. The same will be true of the other Selfridges shops in the UK. Okay, so at this point, the writer is at pains to show that they've considered this in a kind of balanced way, because they're saying here, I can see their point of view. So it's using the epistemic modal auxiliary verb can there to show that it's a reasoned argument. And he's also hedged his opinion with an adverbial there, probably, which kind of links in with understandably as well. So it's shown that it's a reasonably kind of nuanced kind of argument that's being put forward. But look at this collocation here, on the side of. So here is a writer who is coming down on one side and is basically supporting the bosses at Selfridges. So on the side of is a kind of collocation from the semantic field of kind of sporting rivalry, and it reinforces this idea that language is often seen as something that's an either or, that it's kind of like two ends of a continuum. You're either over here or you're over there. And basically he's framing this idea of language in terms of image, and he's associating the use of standard English with what he's calling a cosmopolitan image, and he's putting Selfridges in the context of the fact that it's a nationwide brand, and therefore lots of people there will not be local. Okay, so there he's kind of putting forward the beginnings of a counter argument to the argument that was put forward at the end of the first paragraph. Local expressions, aided by regional accents, can hinder understanding. It is good manners to make sure that the person to whom you are talking comprehends the first time around. We should not have to repeat ourselves. Right, so here it's drawing upon this discourse about understanding, and there's this concern that if people don't use standard English, then they won't be intelligible to other people. So you've got that discourse there. You've also got the discourse of politeness as well. So this association that if you're speaking standard English, then you're being polite. And therefore, if you're speaking non-standard English, you must be being rude in some way. And this is reinforced by the slightly archaic use of this relative pronoun whom, the object pronoun whom, which is used, I think, 3 times in this article as it goes on. So the writer is consciously using these standardized forms in order to demonstrate that he is somebody who admires the status of standard English. Okay, so then we move on into the 4th paragraph. Those who have heard me speak will tell you that I speak posh. I would say I don't speak posh, just the Queen's English, but that is a debate for another time. My voice, setting modesty aside, can be understood wherever. I was in China earlier this year on a speaking tour of the south of the country, and had I spoken with the slight Bristolian's twang I used to have as a child, being from Bristol, then the Chinese people with whom I was speaking may not have understood fully what I was saying. In a job where communication is essential, and in giving good customer service, communication is definitely essential. You have to make sure your audience is put first. So here he's kind of relying upon a kind of anecdotal experience here as a way of developing his argument. Notice the numbers of first-person pronouns that dominate this paragraph. So it's quite different from what we've had in the first 3 paragraphs because it's all about his personal experience. He uses kind of non-standard language in the way that he gives us the phrase "speak posh," and he kind of undermines that idea of speaking posh and challenges it because he says, "Oh, well, I don't think I do speak posh." He thinks that he speaks the Queen's English. So rather than using a term like linguists would use, like received pronunciation, he uses the noun phrase Queen's English, which of course has quite high status because of the associations between royalty and hierarchical power. So he makes it plain that the language that he uses is high status, it's a standard English form, and therefore he is likely to be understood wherever he goes. And so he gives us evidence of his international travels and his successful speaking tours in the Far East. And he shows that actually he's had the forethought to modify his local accent from Bristol that he used to have as a child, because he's basically understanding all about audience. So this is kind of demonstrating his politeness and the way that he's accommodating his audience, and it's laying down the importance of standard English as a tool for communication to all sorts of people. I have lived in Manchester for 3 years now, and even though I'm getting much more used to the dialect and less than subtle accent, there are times when I have to ask people to repeat things. I shouldn't have to, really. I shouldn't have to strain my ears when listening to people. I love listening to accents, and contrary to popular belief, I don't think everyone should talk like what I do, but they must be understandable. It's only when accents become unintelligible that I have the problem. So we've got a continued paragraph here with anecdotal information that's being produced. We get to find out how long he's stayed in this local area. He talks about his enthusiasm for what he calls local dialects and accents. He calls the accents less than subtle, so there's a kind of implicature going on here with slightly pejorative kind of meanings. So he's a bit disparaging about the regional accent. His complaint is that localized accents are sometimes not understandable, they're unintelligible, and that creates a problem. And even though he loves listening to accents, then that's the biggest problem that there is. And he uses like what I do in a kind of consciously non-standard way there, humorous way, in order to demonstrate that he's talking about the difference between standard and non-standard English. What Selfridges maybe should have told their staff to use was their social intelligence. If they start interacting with a customer whom they can clearly tell is from the local area, then let loose and use as many Mancunian sentences that their hearts desire. But if they start interacting with a customer that does not talk in the same way, then hold back and use a more formal register of language. Okay, so here he's slightly shifting his position. So rather than simply agreeing with Selfridges' viewpoint, it's saying, well, maybe the advice to the workers should have been modified a little bit. And he uses this phrase, social intelligence. So this is kind of related in with Howard Giles's accommodation theory, that basically people should be encouraged to interpret their audience and therefore converge with the way that their listener is speaking. Okay, so it's saying that people should be flexible in the way that they use, and that there are certain situations when it is acceptable to be using your local accent and dialect, and there are other situations, depending on your audience, where it calls for a more formal kind of register. Finally, I do wonder, though, how the shop assistants in the Trafford and Exchange Square branches who complained about being censored would feel if a Londoner speaking in broad Cockney rhyming slang went in and asked for a pair of trousers and directions to the gents' loo. Would they understand the customer? Probably not. Okay, so we're back to this idea of banning, complaints and censoring. And so this is doing what lots of opinion articles do. It's kind of ending the article, reminding us of how the article began, which is a kind of anaphoric technique that's being used. He's making an analogy between the misunderstanding that surely would arise if a Londoner went around speaking in broad Cockney rhyming slang with the kind of local expressions that the Mancunian shop assistants were using at the beginning of the article, which you might think is a fair or maybe an unfair connection that he's making. At the end of the paragraph, he does this adjacency exchange with a kind of question-answer, a rhetorical question of would they understand the customer? So there's a fairly obvious kind of rhetorical device that's being used there. And if the staff really don't like the new Selfridges policy, they can always go and work elsewhere. So interesting here that he's talking about standard English so much, and he begins the final one-sentence paragraph with a coordinating connective like that. So that really lowers the level of formality and makes it feel like a piece of conversation, giving us a little bit of synthetic personalization that's going on. And he's making the argument here that, well, people can pick and choose their jobs, can't they? And if they're not happy with the rules that have been imposed, they can just disappear and work somewhere else, which you might consider to be quite a reductive kind of argument. So all in all, a pretty prescriptive viewpoint, perhaps not extreme, because there are nuances there and some kind of acknowledgements and empathy with the counter-argument, but in the main, a fairly prescriptive viewpoint about language usage. Now that is in comparison with our text B. This is HuffPost Super User. So as I said before, this is a comment that's been left by somebody who's read the article, read some other people's comments, and is now hitting the keyboard. So William Hanson is neither pompous nor a snob. So straight away, we've got quite kind of direct language that's being used, which, and similar to the beginning of the article, the previous article, shows that language is often a battleground for conflict. Here you've got a post-modifying adjective pompous, which is quite pejorative. You've also got an equally pejorative noun that's being used, snob. So it looks like this comment has read some quite direct, critical comments following the article and is having their say as well. So it's continuing this discourse of conflict going on. And notice the use of the copular verb here is. It's not saying maybe, or it's not using any modal auxiliary verbs like it could be considered or it might be. It's just is. So the copular verb is used here, and in fact it's used all the way through here to give a very direct kind of viewpoint. So William Hanson is neither pompous nor a snob, unless being one of the few people in journalism who can speak and write Queen's English is pompous or snobbish. So there's quite a bold kind of claim, there's an assertion being made there that journalists don't know how to use standard English. Like William Hanson, this contributor also uses the noun phrase Queen's English as well. So that's a kind of loaded noun phrase that's all about status, and it shows basically that in this writer's mind, standard English is a superior form to other kind of accent or dialect features. It goes on. It is fashionable since the 1960s to emulate the lowest, most ignorant, worst behaved people in our society. So here, and again, there's the copular verb there. We've got this broad kind of sociological statement that's being made about society generally over a huge amount of time. So a very kind of generalized, vague assertion. And then we've got a fairly obvious kind of rhetorical device being used here with a list of three and the use of the repeated superlative adjectives, lowest, most ignorant, and worst behaved. And so what it's trying to do is trying to link together, I suppose, non-standard forms of English with low levels of education and bad behaviour. The trend is already exhausted. Notice the use of the trend there implies that using non-standard English is just a fashion and that it'll just fade away. The trend is already exhausted. And Mr. Hanson, notice the use of the honorific title there, Mr. Hanson, to give it a kind of elevated status. Mr. Hanson is showing us the future. So it's attributing to Hanson some kind of clairvoyant powers that he's able actually to read the future, showing us the future when the English-speaking world will recover its aspiration to speak and write correctly and restore civilized norms of etiquette and behavior to the ordinary transactions of life. So it's got quite huge hyperbole here, a kind of rhetorical flight of fancy. In terms of discourses, we've got some interesting verbs being used here because we've got recover and restore, which kind of links in with Jean Acheson's crumbling castle kind of idea that in the past English had a kind of purity which is fast dissolving. So again, it's heavily prescriptive. So in that sense, it's similar to Article A, but it's more so because there's no acknowledgement made of any kind of counter-argument. And it's pretty kind of bold, direct claims being made about the absolute superiority about standard English. So it's a fascinating little text to be given that. Now then, so let's just take one step back. There you are in the exam. All those things have whizzed through your mind when you've been reading those texts. And now you've got to think about your approach to how you would actually write an answer to this. So you read through the texts, and in so doing, you try and identify the attitudes and arguments that are being presented. If it's applicable, you certainly use the terms prescriptive, i.e. being highly judgmental about language, or descriptive, i.e. celebrating or defending diversity in language. But make sure that you track the ideas, and like I said earlier on, don't assume that there's just going to be necessarily one single viewpoint through the whole article, because the attitudes may shift. And indeed, you might have a variety of different attitudes that are going on there, which may not be the text producer's ideas, i.e. they may be quoting another expert, or they may be putting forward a counter-argument. So you're doing all of those things. You're also identifying the discourses. So what sorts of different discourses are you spotting? Are you seeing things like conflict or morality or correctness or evolution? And when we say discourses, if you're struggling to get a handle over what that means, just think semantic fields. So discourses are kind of extended semantic fields, ways of arguing. So how do these attitudes that we've had in this bit here, how do they relate to these discourses which are being put forward? And then finally, your close linguistic analysis. So this is where your AO1 knowledge really pays off dividends, because you've got your 7 language levels, haven't you, with phonology and grammar and pragmatics and semantics and lexis and graphology and all the rest of them. So by this stage in the course, you should be able to label very precisely the parts of the language with very precise terms that you wouldn't have been able to do at a GCSE level. Okay, so these are the 3 things that you're doing in your approach to this question. Now remember, it's comparison, okay, and 15 out of the 40 marks are for the comparison bit. So here's a list of the sort of things that you need to be comparing between the 2 texts. First of all, what about the attitudes being presented? Are they similar? Are they different? Are they a bit of a mixture? Secondly, what are the discourses that are being used in the text? Are they drawing upon similar or different discourses, and for what purposes? The language features, the lexis, the grammar, the pragmatics, the phonology, etc. Are they drawing upon similar kind of language features or different language features in order to try and influence the reader? And then finally, what about context? I.e. considerations about like the implied audience, the genre, i.e. the type of text that this is for, the place of publication, the purposes. How are those all impacting comparatively on the 2 texts? So it's not easy. What you need to do in your first paragraph is to do a really nice summary. You need to really get to the heart of the articles. You can't just, and I see this all the time with students, they sort of see the headline and the byline of text 1 and they just start writing about that. You can't do that. You've got to read completely the 2 articles. You've got to get the gist of what the argument is all about. And you've got to show that you understand the main discourses that are going on, where these writers are basically on a prescriptive, descriptive continuum, and some kind of consideration about the contextual factors that are linking to the language. So I'll just small this a little bit. An example would be this. Hanson, writing online for an adult audience interested in news and social comment, argues that Selfridges is right to insist on its staff using fewer localised language forms in dealing with non-local customers. Queen of Fern, responding to other users' comments, defends Hanson's views, arguing the importance of upholding correct and civilised forms of language and behaviour. Both writers promote overall prescriptive stances, though Hanson's article also acknowledges a number of descriptive views. That's a nice opening paragraph, because it gives the sense that you, the student, have got an overview of the articles before you get down to the nitty-gritty on the detail. Look at here how you've got AO3 context, because it just mentions about the mode and the audience. In this case, it's writing online for an adult audience. So it's immediately throwing in an AO3 comment. In this first sentence, all this bit that goes after argues that. It's basically concisely, very nicely summarising the text A argument in only a few words. It doesn't go around the houses and spend sentences and sentences doing it. It just does it neatly in one particular sentence. You need to try and do that. You've then got comments about the second text in that first paragraph. Again, it summarises the text B argument. This bit here, it's summarising the argument. And on the last bit, the very last sentence, it's identifying where the writer stands on this prescriptive, descriptive continuum. It's making a comparison between them. And also the use of the adverb both there shows that this is doing AO4, it's doing comparison. So there's not many words here, but it's doing a lot, and it's kind of hitting all of these AOs that you want to. So that's what you want to try and do in your opening paragraph for any kind of question 3 answer. You then need to think about, well, how are you going to structure your answer? And of course, the answer is through topic sentences. So before you start writing your essay, you've got to kind of note down 5 or 6 different main paragraph groupings that you're going to have. and the topic sentences, the comparative topic sentences. Here's some examples. Both texts draw upon the discourse of conflict, though in different ways. There you go. So that sets you up for a really nice paragraph that's about these discourses of conflict through the two texts. Both texts present prescriptive views about language, but with different levels of subtlety. It's a nice comparison because it's saying, well, they're similar, like both texts are prescriptive, but actually there is a difference between them. So straight away in these topic sentences, you're getting tick, tick, tick for your AO4, your comparison. The two texts use similar grammatical features to influence their implied audience's responses. Now this is nice because then you're showing off your linguistic methods that you're using, that you can show your examiner that you know exactly what is meant by grammar. So for example, you might be honing in on pronoun usage, or it might be to do with things like adverbials, or it could be modal auxiliary verbs, or it could be to do with sentence structures or sentence functions. Those are the sort of classic grammar features. So if you do a nice topic sentence like that for any articles that you've got, that's likely to be a winner. Text A uses language to acknowledge different aspects of the argument, whereas text B has a narrower focus. That's a bit more on discourse, so it's basically tracing the differences between the arguments that are being put forward. And then finally, both texts use rhetorical devices to persuade their audiences. You know all about rhetorical devices. I know you do, because you've just done your coursework producing your own article. So I'm talking about things like litotes or hyperbole or euphemism or polysyndeton, all those things that are in the textbook on page 266. Those are 5 examples of neat little topic sentences that will be useful for you, whichever articles that you get given in this exam. So then you need to actually construct your essay. Now, what would a single paragraph on this look like? Let's give you an example. So both texts draw upon the discourse of conflict, though in different ways. There's our topic sentence. That's nice as a marker. I'm thinking, right, I'm just going to hear about the discourse of conflict all the way through this paragraph. In text A, the material verb banned and the mental verb reacted represent opposition between two conflicting sides. In this case, between the bosses, who have instrumental power, and the employees who have prescriptive language rules imposed upon them. Hanson's collocation on the side of, from the semantic field of sporting rivalry, suggests that this linguistic topic requires the writer, and perhaps the implied reader, to adopt a strong stance, a typical genre feature of opinion journalism. Okay, so in this bit, we've got a lot of nice, focused, close detail on text A. Notice these AO1 terms, that whenever we're quoting individual words here, we are showing off to our examiner that we know exactly the word classes. We know that banned could be described as a material verb. We know that reacted could be described as a mental verb. And we've got other arrows in our quiver, like instrumental power, for example. And we're using the word collocation, meaning a bunch of words which are usually expected to be together. And we're using that word semantic field here. We're doing all of those things. So we're doing loads of AO1 stuff there. And we're also linking it into AO3 context as well, because at the end there, it's showing consideration of what an opinion art journalism, piece of journalism does. You know, it tries to provoke by giving you a strong stance. It's a typical genre feature of opinion journalism. So far we've had text A, so we've got a lot of good AO1 and AO3 stuff going on there, but no AO4 at all, which is comparison, which is why then we go into this. Text B's use of the pre-modifying adjective pompous and the pejorative label snob also demonstrates that this language debate has stirred strong conflicting emotions in readers. Super uses direct combative defense of Hanson's viewpoint, uses the dogmatic copular verb is in the first line to convey a strong sense of certainty. This single-minded stance contrasts with text A's hedging, for example, his empathy with Selfridges workers signalled by the adverb of manner, understandably, showing the latter's more nuanced approach to the argument. Text B's directness can perhaps be explained by its genre. This is not professional journalism, but a member of the public reacting instinctively to the article and other readers' comments. End of paragraph. I've put them into separate boxes there, so it looks like there's 3 different paragraphs, but actually that's one extended paragraph. So you've got your topic sentence here, discourse of conflict. You've got supporting evidence, which focuses in on ideas to do with the discourse of conflict in text A. And then you've got comparative stuff with text B, showing the similarities between the two of them, again with very close AO1 examination. But again, at the end of the article, it's interesting because it's honing in on AO3 considerations. It's thinking about the different genres of the text. And it's shown that there are actually, although there are similarities between them, there are actually some quite subtle differences between them as well. So that's a great paragraph, and that's the sort of thing that I want you to be aiming towards doing, that really close precision of language, using the word discourse all the way through, trying to show the similarities but also the differences between the articles. It needs practice, okay? And what I want you to be doing then is to be doing your own version. So obviously I've given you an example opening, I've given you example topic sentences, I've given you an example extended paragraph. But it's over to you now, because you need to have control of it and you need to get the hang of writing your own article. In the future, of course, I will not be holding your hand and I will not be talking through the articles in any way. I'll just be giving them to you. But this is just a practice one to get you going. So here are just some final tips for writing your discourse analysis. Keep it comparative all the way through. Use precise AO1 terms that you wouldn't have been able to use as a GCSE English student. Make sure that you don't just feature spot, that you're linking the language and style features to the writer's actual meanings and representations. I know that's the title of the paper 1 section A thing, but it's just as relevant here because it's all about the ideas. Don't just write about the style features as if they're important in themselves. They're not important in themselves. They're only important in carrying an argument. Make sure that you're keep using the word discourses all the way through your argument. Do the AO3 stuff really nicely. So link the language to the implied audiences, the purposes, the genres, and the wider contexts. Do make sure that you draw upon a wide range of language levels. We find that the weaker students often focus on lexis, and that's it. They get stuck on lexis. What you need to be doing is you make sure that you're doing things to do with pragmatics, discourse, grammar, lexis, all over the shop. You've got your 7 different language levels. You know, you should be drawing upon your knowledge on all of them, with the one thing that don't spend ages on graphology. In fact, don't spend any time on graphology really, because once you start writing about the images that are produced with an article or the font size or style, then you're in the realm of media studies and you won't get any marks for language. So draw upon all the language levels, but go easy on graphology. And then finally, because you're going to get quite difficult texts, you do need to be attentive to implied meanings. You're going to have to infer certain things. So, for example, there might be intertextual references that are given to you in the texts, or there might be some element of irony where the words seem to have kind of like a surface meaning, but they've got deeper meanings that are going on underneath it. Okay. So that's the end of this little presentation for today. You need to be getting on and doing your own writing to that essay. And I can't wait to see your results. Thank you very much. I will see you on another time. And the next time that we meet, we will talk through the mysteries of question 4, which is the opinion article that you write at the end of this exam. Goodbye.